if you think about it, it's a very delicate thing, isn't it? There's so many different types of religion, or what people call religion. When they say spirituality, there are a dozen or more things that people tend to mean. The media, the press, doesn't know exactly what to do with this phenomenon of spirituality or religion. The press seems to know only two people that believe in God. One is George Bush and one is Osama bin Laden. And the press isn't sure which is more dangerous. Those who look into spirituality or religion in just for more than an hour realize that there are at least two very different types of spirituality and religion. And there are many different ways to categorize them. Traditionally, they're referred to as esoteric and exoteric, the inner and outer forms. Another way of looking at it is that some of the forms of religion are clearly pre-rational, magic and mythic. And yet other forms of religion and spirituality are trans-rational. They're deeply, deeply contemplative and move beyond any ordinary categories of reason and logic, but not beneath it. They transcend and include reason. They are not anti-rational. So how indeed to get this kind of conversation going in the modern world, it's very difficult. Because if you look at some of the more dogmatic forms of religion, not that dogma is bad, it has its place. But if you look at these types that we're calling exoteric religion, or religion of myth and dogma, it's arguably the cause of more human suffering and death than any other man-made cause on the face of the planet. And yet, if you look at the great paths of liberation, those contemplative paths that have claimed to show men and women a doorway in the deepest part of their own consciousness to that realm which is timeless and spaceless and beyond death and pain and mortality. So on the one hand, we have religion causing the most human suffering imaginable, and on the other hand, the only path out of human suffering that we know of. How to get that conversation going? Extraordinarily difficult, and yet there arguably is no more important conversation than we can have. It's of course gotten extremely urgent given the fact that so many of the wars that human males are involved in, I was going to say men and women, but that humanity is involved in, really are religious. We're certainly facing this with the what most people in the West refer to as terrorism, and those who are involved in it simply refer to it basically as militant orientation. But we see that in the news now daily. And so how do we deal with that? And what distinctions can we make? How can we say what we need is more spirituality in our lives, when more spirituality causes more suffering and pain than any other thing we know? If we can't come up with some distinctions that make sense and that men and women everywhere can begin to agree on, then simply saying all you need is love, or all you need is God, or all you need is more religion or spirituality might be a prescription for disaster. We are at Integral Spiritual Center, which Father Thomas and I are members, particularly looking at a handful of concepts that help us get a handle on some of these distinctions in spirituality and religion. And indeed, one of them is what we call the pre-trans fallacy, or the pre-post fallacy, the fact that pre-rational engagements and trans-rational engagements are often confused simply because both are non-rational. We're also looking at a concept called the conveyor belt. We'll be glad to talk about that. That religion actually is one of the very few human disciplines that seems to span the entire spectrum of human development, moving from archaic levels or waves of consciousness to magic, to mythic, to rational, to pluralistic, to integral and superintegral. There's no other discipline that really covers that entire spectrum. And yet the evidence now is becoming extremely convincing that men and women have these great levels or stages, waves of consciousness available to them cross-culturally. And that part of what religion in its highest effort can do is help men and women move from the pre-rational forms of religion to the rational forms to the trans-rational. Now, religion does a lot of other things, but there's an enormous amount of evidence that it can do that. Another concept that we find useful is the distinction between stages of development or stages of consciousness and states of consciousness. And we can go into that a little bit. I just mentioned some of the widely accepted stages of human development, archaic to magic, to mythic, to rational, to pluralistic, to integral, and higher. But at any of those stages, men and women can have powerful religious experiences. And these states of consciousness can be oriented towards nature, they can be oriented towards deity forms, they can be oriented towards vast formless emptiness. You can have those religious experiences at virtually any stage of development. And so this means that religion or powerful, authentic spirituality is not available merely at the highest stages of development, because you can have these temporary peak experiences at virtually any stage. But what we do find is that you tend to interpret your religious experience according to the stage you're at. So if you're at a magical stage of development and you have an experience of a vast, luminous cloud of love and bliss, experience of overwhelming compassion, clarity, oneness with everything that's arising, and you're at a magical level, you will tend to interpret it in magical terms. If you're at a mythic level, you'll tend to interpret it in mythic terms. There are many people at rational stages of development that have these experiences, and they interpret them in very rational terms and often try to explain it away. It's just fireworks in the brain. Somebody at the mythic level might interpret it as an encounter with a literal figure, Jesus perhaps, or one of the bodhisattvas, or an angel. If you move into pluralistic stages, typically postmodern interpretations, first you'll try to deconstruct it. If it doesn't go away, you'll say, well, it's true for me, but not necessarily true for you. When you get to the integral stages, which is one of the things that we might want to talk about, psychologists continually find that starting at these stages that many of them call integrated or integral are the first stages that actually attempt to integrate all of the previous stages. One of the definitions of these earlier stages of human development is that each of those stages thinks that their truth is the only truth that's actually correct. And once you get to an integral stage, you realize that all of those truths are appropriate and correct in their own place, in their own time. And so there's an attempt to try to integrate all of these different worldviews and to make room for them. And so that becomes a very, very important aspect in terms of trying to understand men and women's approach to the divine. And that gives us a handle on some of these very, very difficult issues. And religion as a conveyor belt is basically a catechism, if you will, of the stations of life as you move from archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral interpretations of the divine. It doesn't necessarily mean that there are levels of God, but it does mean there are levels of your interpretation of God. And these can be followed with quite astonishing similarity if we actually do empirical research on this. So the conveyor belt is one of these ideas we find useful, and states and stages are useful because at any of these stages you can have a spiritual experience. Meditative practice is a practice in having these state experiences. And the more you have a spiritual or meditative experience of the divine, the more quickly you move through stages. And incidentally, we have some empirical research on that as well. This doesn't mean that there's no reason to belong to a particular spiritual path. There's every reason to belong to a particular spiritual path. The very least, as the Japanese say, chase two rabbits, catch neither. And it's you can understand that there are many paths to the divine. Which path is best is which path is best for you. The one that helps you move to your own fullest potential in terms of being able to open yourself to the divine in whatever ways work for you is the best path. And so we can talk about that as well. The final concept that we find useful in interpreting these many, many different ways that men and women around the world have approached the divine is what we call the 1, 2, 3 of God. And this means that there is another very important way that men and women interpret the divine. And the 1, 2, 3 refers to the first, second, and third person perspectives. And many of you are familiar with that. A first person perspective means the perspective of the person who's speaking. Second person is the person being spoken to. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So common pronouns for first person are I, me, mine. And plural of first person is we, us. Second person is you. And third person is him, her, they, and it. And we often use it because third person approaches tend to be very objective, almost scientific. You can approach, and the great saints and sages have approached the divine from each of these perspectives. And again, it appears that they're contradictory or conflicting if you don't realize the perspectives of the same thing. There have been enormous theological and philosophical battles over what's the ultimate perspective of spirit. So what's a first person? Well, let's start with a third person perspective of spirit. Is when you picture spirit in an objective way, maybe our ultimate reality in an objective way, perhaps the great web of life, or nature itself. You look at this vast expanse of nature and you say, there is spirit, there is the divine. You can't miss it. That's a third person approach to spirit. Second person approach to spirit says, well, that's fine, but it does seem that it's not really directing a second person, is it? It's not actually confronting and talking with an intelligence. So imagine a vast, great intelligence that built the Grand Canyon, that built all of this extraordinary nature. Where was the divine before the Big Bang? What intelligence? It doesn't have to be a person as we think of a person. The sages and theologians are much more sophisticated about what a person means. As if we say God might be a trinity, for example, of three persons. A person is just any sort of being that has intelligence. And that's the universe applies. It works that way. So a second person can also be a little bit more personified as a metaphoric way to approach spirit. So in that mode, spirit is approached as a great thou, as a living, breathing, vital reality that you can talk to, and it will, or she will, talk back to you. Spirit in first person is I amness. It's the pure subject in you, the pure awareness in you, that is the first person face of God. And the mystics in particular often rely on this perspective, because they point out one thing, that if you want to know spirit, this unavoidable aspect of spirit that we were singing about, the only thing that you're ever aware of is this I amness in you. And you are aware I am existing right now. This I amness is the only thing that's constant in you. If you think of what in your experience right now is the same 5 minutes ago, I amness. You had the same I amness. Not as an object, but as the pure awareness. So objects come and go. You have thoughts, You have feelings, you have sensations, but what's aware of them? What is this witness in you that is aware of sensations as they come and go? And this great I amness was present now, was present 5 minutes ago, it was present 5 hours ago, it was present 5 centuries ago. Before Abraham was, I am. And this vast I amness, this pure subjectivity, this Atman that is Brahman, is spirit in first person. So which of these three perspectives is correct? All of them. And one of the great things that we have been able to learn by putting various cultures together and looking at this extraordinary experiment of millennia of human beings opening themselves to the ground of being and the great intelligence that brought forth all of this, moment to moment, is that spirit can be approached in first, second, and third person perspectives because spirit is big enough to contain all of those. So using some of these concepts allows us to get a handle on the many, many different approaches that men and women have taken to the divine and that the divine has taken towards us.